Rock comes first as a shadow, then a weight, then it closes in like a wall. In the first week of January 1873, the initial sensation of the American military unit stepping into the lava beds of Northern California was not fear, it was bewilderment. The region referred to as rocky terrain in long-range communications consisted of merely a small note on the lined pages of tactical manuals. The reality was different. The basalt that had erupted from the bowels of the Cascade mountain range thousands of years ago had created a unique labyrinth as it cooled and solidified. This area, where regular geography vanished, replaced by the dominance of black, jagged masses interlocking like pieces of a puzzle, also harbored an underground system that seemed to swallow half of its surface area. Lava tube caves, natural trenches, narrow passageways, horizontal crevices where a human chest could barely fit, and within, upon, and between these a bottomless sense of depth, not being sure if the ground would hold when stepping on it, not being sure if the stone would cut when leaning a hand against it. The unit entered this terrain, known by its English name, lava beds. Command assessed that Captain Jack and his warriors were stationed in the northern sector. Reports indicated between 50 and 60 warriors. The army, however, exceeded 1,000 men, including regular infantry, volunteer cavalry, and artillery units. This ratio created a sense of relief in the upper echelons of the chain of command. Numerical superiority is not a substitute for strategy, but a calculation with far fewer variables had never been laid on the command table. The side that knows this terrain has an advantage beyond numbers against the side that does not. The Modocs were born in this terrain. The first fire came shortly after the unit fully entered the terrain. No one yet knew where to look. To see the enemy must be in a visible place. This simple prerequisite was dysfunctional in the lava beds. The sharp flame of rifle barrels flashed from the depths of the rocks. A bullet dragged through a soldier's shoulder. He fell. Those around him reflexively threw themselves to the ground. Then another flash, from another direction. Then one more. Did 3 distinct shots from 3 different points originate from behind a single rocky ridge or from 3 separate positions? The answer, at that moment, was unknowable. And the answer was not the most dangerous question anyway. The truly dangerous question was this: from which direction will the next bullet come? Beginning to ask this question is not where military effectiveness starts. It is where it ends. A human cannot focus their attention in all directions at once. Every point outside the field of vision turns into a potential point of death. The lava beds reduced the American soldiers' field of vision to a few meters. Every rock mass was a curtain, every crevice a trap. Speaking in the terminology of battlefield forensics, when tactical visibility approaches 0, the number of trump cards in a commander's hand also decreases. If you have no target to shoot at, artillery and rifles are nothing but heavy metal. The army made its tactical error in the first hours. They moved the column into the terrain as a whole. Advancing in a single formation was impossible. The terrain rejected it. Passageways between rocks sometimes could not accommodate 2 people side by side. This made establishing a regular front line impossible. The units broke apart. They turned into small groups. Each of these groups drifted into a different corridor of a labyrinth, unaware of one another. Command could not see the whole. Each group could only see the few rocks immediately around them. The Modoc positions, on the other hand, were systematic. Men who had grown up in this terrain knew every indentation and protrusion by heart. Which passageway is visible, from which crevice, behind which ridge you must hide to see someone approaching from the east, which tube cave allows you to enter through one passage and exit through another. All of this was mapped knowledge to them. They had positioned their forces according to this knowledge. After firing, they changed positions. By crawling, climbing, and using the narrow passages between the rocks, they moved from one point to another. While the American soldier kept his face pressed to the ground, The Modoc warrior was already in a crevice 30 meters away. This was not a war. It was a hunt. At the end of the first day, the unit gathered its casualties. The number of dead and wounded was a small fraction of the total fighting force, but there was something more important than numbers. No one had seen a single Modoc warrior. Nothing but flashing muzzle flames, not the sounds coming from behind the rocks, not a visible target. Nothing. Command reports struggled to describe this situation. Military terminology seemed not to have coined a word for an unseen enemy. To understand the immediate experience of the soldiers with their faces pressed to the ground, one must turn to psychology. The human brain is designed to identify danger and produce a response to it. The operation of this mechanism requires the danger to be identifiable. An invisible danger is the most frustrating form of danger, because neither the flight nor fight reflex has any outlet. Both options require action. Action requires orientation toward a target. If there is no target, action cannot find a direction. The result is not freezing. It is literal paralysis. The organism can do nothing because it does not know what to do. This is exactly what the unit did on the first day. Faces to the ground. No movement. The commander's voice at times could not carry past a rock. There were no radios. Messages were carried by word of mouth, but the terrain hindered this transmission as well. Even if the distance between two groups was less than 20 meters, the intervening rocky ridge cut off or distorted the sound. Toward evening, the fog began to descend. Pacific-sourced, dense, and cold. Visibility had already dropped to a few meters. The fog eradicated it completely. The warriors ceased their fire. The American forces retreated. The first day ended like this. An army of 1,000 men against a group of 50 had retreated without achieving a single tangible result. Writing this fact into the reports brought about a separate problem altogether. Fog arrives in the lava beds in the early morning hours. First it wraps around the ankles, then it rises to the waist, then it swallows everything. This fog rolling in from the Pacific is different from the familiar, damp fog of the coastal regions. The wave volcanic basalt retains heat differently. The irregular fluctuation of surface temperatures overnight, the fragmented structure of the topography, when all these come together, they turn the fog into an unpredictable weapon. A fighter might see 10 meters ahead 1 second and be unable to see his own hand the next. This transformation gives no warning. It is not gradual. The fog flows through the passages between the rocks. It settles and closes in. The American command had tried to calculate this variable. Tried, but on paper. Every calculation made without knowing the terrain unraveled in the practice of the next day. The Modocs knew this fog. They knew when it would arrive, how long it would last, and from which direction it would thicken. The American unit, however, read the fog as a tactical obstacle, a false reading. For the Modocs, the fog was a cover. It was a window to move. It was a block of time they used to change positions, carry back the wounded, and resupply. While the American forces remained immobile when the fog descended, the Modocs spent their most productive hours within this invisibility. By the second week, the discipline within the unit had begun to crack. This crack first became apparent in small things. The time it took to execute orders lengthened. Delays occurred in guard shifts. A private had heard the commander's voice but refused to step out from behind the rock. When asked for the reason, his answer both entered the official records and lodged itself somewhere in the commander's mind. If I go out, they will see me. This sentence can be evaluated in terms of tactical logic. Advancing in the open means being visible. Being visible increases the risk of death in the lava beds. The logic is consistent. But when this logic begins to spread within a unit, it melts away one of the cornerstones of the command structure. An order has ceased to be an automatic mechanism of obedience. It is being questioned. And when an order is questioned, a process begins where subsequent orders will be questioned for longer periods. The commander's tools were limited. Artillery had ceased to be a strategic weapon in this terrain. To determine target coordinates, the enemy either had to be visible, or their position had to be precisely known. Neither was available. The artillery fired volleys several times toward the general directions from which the fire came. The shells struck the rocks, shattered, and some fragments scattered. The damage was uncertain. Modoc casualties, if any, were never confirmed. The sound of the artillery was immense. Its impact was minimal. This too contributed to a psychological devastation in its own right. The unit had used its heaviest weapon and achieved no concrete results. The situation of the rifle units was even more convoluted. Regular infantry training teaches to aim at a visible target. You aim at the target, pull the trigger and observe the result. This cycle is the backbone of the tactical reflex. The lava beds had broken this cycle. Soldiers began firing toward the muzzle flames coming from the depths of the rocks. This was shooting at a light, not a visible target, and the light was merely the trace left behind by a warrior who had long since departed from his source and changed positions. Then came the disaster. A predictable disaster, but devastating nonetheless. A group of privates lost coordination in the fog. As they advanced among the rocks, they heard gunfire from both the front and the flank. They threw themselves to the ground in a panic. Another group was approaching from the right. Silhouettes could not be distinguished in the fog. The group on the left opened fire. The ones on the right were American privates. 2 privates were wounded, one of them severely. This incident falls into the category known in military historiography as friendly fire. The terminology sterilizes the event. What actually happened was this. The unit had begun hunting itself. This is not merely a tactical failure. It is the crossing of a psychological threshold. In a battlefield where the enemy is invisible, the moment the friendly soldier also becomes invisible, every shadow, every sound, every movement turns into a potential source of threat. This paranoia is enough to render an organized unit dysfunctional. The officers saw this. Not all of them, but enough. Diaries have recorded this period. A captain wrote in his log that the private's perspective on the rocks is no longer operational. Another officer noted that he could not explain why morning orders were not executed until the afternoon. These statements are sanitized observations, having passed through the filter of military bureaucracy. The underlying truth is simpler. The men were no longer taking orders. They were trying to survive. These two overlap in most battlefields. In the lava beds, they did not overlap. The Modoc's war strategy was not purely a military strategy. This must be understood at this point. Captain Jack and his advisors, especially Scarface Charlie and Boston Charlie, were conducting a mass psychology operation. 50 warriors could not destroy 1,000 men. They knew this, but they could render 1,000 men useless, and the way to do this was to neutralize numerical superiority with psychological despair. Every invisible shot was a step in this strategy. Every change of position was a part of this strategy. Every hour the American soldier spent immobile was a gain for this strategy. By the 3rd week, supply issues began to become apparent. The roads leading to the lava beds were already difficult in the harsh winter conditions. Ammunition could be delivered, but evacuating casualties, transporting the wounded back, rotating fresh troops, each of these had turned into a logistical strain. Illness also began to appear within the unit. Being exposed to the cold wind on volcanic basalt at night, remaining motionless for hours in the damp fog, the time these took to deplete the body was below expectations. But the real exhaustion was not physical. A soldier bandages his wound, endures the cold. Psychological attrition works differently. It is cumulative and silent. The fighter enters the same rocks every morning and emerges every evening having achieved nothing. This cycle is tolerable after 1 week. It grows heavy after 2 weeks. After 3 weeks, it becomes a weight carried no longer just on the shoulders but in decision-making mechanisms. On the command front, a different reckoning had begun. How would the fact that a unit of 1,000 men had failed to resolve a group of 50 in 3 weeks be reported to Washington? This question had superseded the tactical problem. And this shift, safeguarding institutional reputation, replacing military success, would directly affect the quality of subsequent decisions. Now a peace conference was coming to the table. The idea of a peace conference was born not as a military solution, but as a diplomatic exit. This distinction is important. A military solution is produced on the field. A diplomatic exit is an alternative produced by the side that acknowledges the field is deadlocked. By the end of January 1873, the American command realized they were deadlocked on the field. Washington was applying pressure. The press had begun to question the prolongation of the operation. The inability of an army of 1,000 to resolve a group of 50 in 3 weeks was a difficult reality to explain on newspaper pages. In this context, peace talks emerged as both a moral and institutional way out. A peace commission was formed. It was headed by one of the most senior Pacific Army officers of the era, Brigadier General Edward Richard Sprigg Canby. There were several reasons why Canby was chosen. He had undertaken important duties in the Civil War. His conduct in the Battle of Glorieta Pass against Confederate forces in the Southwest was remembered with respect in military circles. In bureaucratic circles, he was known as a resolute yet measured commander. He did not panic, did not make hasty decisions, and looked out for institutional balance. It made sense for a peace commission chairman to possess these traits, but Canby had one more trait. He did not know his enemy. This was not an individual failure. It was institutional blindness. The American military structure had systematically underestimated the Modoc warriors. Their numbers were few, their weapons limited. They had no supply lines and no fixed territory. These were the assessments on paper. The assessments on paper had not accounted for the basalt of the lava beds. They had not accounted for Captain Jack's strategic brilliance. And most importantly, they had not accounted for what a cornered group with nothing left to lose might do. Peace negotiations began in March 1873. Initial contacts were cautious. While participating in the talks, the Modoc side laid out their demands clearly: a permanent reserve in the lava beds, not to be sent to the Klamath Reservation. These were demands that Washington had no intention of accepting. The talks progressed, but the progress was an illusion. Both sides were sitting at the table, but both sides were doubtful whether the table was producing a real solution. On the Modoc front, there was an internal tension. Captain Jack, whose real name was Kintpuash, did not fully believe in the negotiations, but he had no other option. Ammunition was melting away. The number of warriors was not decreasing, but neither were they inexhaustible. Maintaining the equation was becoming increasingly difficult. A faction of warriors, especially Hooker Jim and his group, argued that the negotiations were in vain. They believed the real solution required a different course of action. This proposed action was relayed to Captain Jack. Captain Jack refused. Not once. He refused several times. The pressure increased. The internal dynamics on the Modoc front were invisible from the outside. The American command and the Peace Commission read the Modoc side as a monolithic structure, a single leader, a single decision-making mechanism. This, too, was a false reading. Captain Jack was not an absolute authority. He managed a delicate balance against advisors, warrior factions, and internal pressures. This balance unraveled in the last week of March 1873. Captain Jack finally conceded. But in this concession, there was a trace of what he had previously refused. April 11th, 1873. The tent set up for the peace talks was in the buffer zone between the two sides. It was designed as an unarmed meeting. The American side adhered to this protocol, at least visibly. Canby arrived at the tent, along with the other members of the Peace Commission. He was accompanied by Indian Affairs Commissioner A.B. Meacham, Reverend Eleazar Thomas, and the interpreter Frank Riddle, along with his wife Toby Riddle. There were no weapons. Protocol demanded it. Captain Jack and the warriors with him also came to the tent. The meeting began. The conversations proceeded slowly and through the interpreter. They covered land demands, reservation borders, and Washington's stance. Canby spoke with an institutional calm. As an experienced negotiator, he avoided being insistent on points where compromise was impossible. He stepped back, reframed, and kept the conversation alive. Then Captain Jack stood up. Toby Riddle had warned them earlier, days ago. She had informed them that the peace talks could be turned into a trap, that the hardliners among the Modocs were preparing a different plan. This warning had not been evaluated with the necessary seriousness. Institutional logic dictated this. An unarmed meeting protocol binds both sides. The possibility of the protocol being violated had been left out of the assessment charts, because such a violation would require crossing a moral line, not just a tactical one. The American command had not thought its enemy capable of crossing that line. This lack of thought was a life-saving information gap. Not for Canby, on the contrary. Captain Jack pulled the pistol from his pocket. He turned toward Canby. He fired. The bullet struck right below Canby's eye. Time inside the tent was suspended for a second. Then everything exploded at once. The other Modoc warriors sprang into action as well. Reverend Thomas was shot after managing to run a few steps. Meacham took multiple bullets, but survived. Frank Riddle and his wife Toby managed to escape. Canby stood for a few seconds before falling to the ground. Then he fell. He did not get back up. In the history of the United States, up to that day and ever since, only one highest-ranking general has been killed in the line of duty, Edward Canby. This statistic did not emerge as an afterthought. That day, from that hour onward, it echoed through every layer of the command structure. The speed at which the news spread was extraordinary for that era. Telegraph lines delivered the information to Washington within hours. The press received the news within days. The reaction could be described as outrage, but that word is insufficient. In a military institution, the murder of a commander is not merely a casualty. It is a symbolic collapse. The commander is the most visible point on the body of the institution. An attack on that point brings the vulnerability of the entire institution to the forefront. Its effect within the unit operated differently. The privates' diaries recorded how the news spread. First it came as a rumor. Then it settled as confirmed information. Then a silence fell. This silence was not mourning. It was deeper. It was something between fear and bewilderment. Canby's death added a new dimension to the fear of invisibility created by the lava beds. It was no longer enough to merely fear the rifle barrel of an unseen enemy. Even the peace tent was unsafe. Even the unarmed protocol was unsafe. Even the seat where the general sat was unsafe. This feeling cannot be described through an analytical process. It is more primal. When every proposed solution is suddenly invalidated, the mind first stops producing solutions. Then it starts letting go entirely. At this point, discipline, training, and hierarchy come face to face with biological panic. And biological panic usually wins. Washington's response was swift. General William Tecumseh Sherman intervened directly. The directive was clear. The negotiations were over. The Modocs would be captured or annihilated. This directive was relayed to the field command. The field command was to act in the same terrain, amid the same problem of invisibility, but this time under a different pressure. Canby's death did not change the war. It did not change the terrain. It did not change the Modoc's tactical superiority, but it radically changed the discourse surrounding what the war was being fought for. This was no longer just an operation to forcibly relocate a tribe. It had turned into a matter of avenging a general, and operations driven by the desire for revenge tend to lack tactical clarity. Meanwhile, in the lava beds, the fog persisted. The human body is the last thing to surrender on a battlefield. The mind may have long since collapsed. Discipline may have scattered, the chain of command loosened, morale decimated. The body keeps going anyway. It sleeps, wakes, walks, eats. This biological persistence is an asset for armies, but the lava beds knew how to erode this asset as well. By mid-April 1873, physical exhaustion within the unit had reached a level that reflected in the reports. One of the most concrete indicators of this, seemingly small but carrying massive symbolic weight, was the boots. The standard American Army boot was a reasonably sturdy product for that era, with its leather sole, thick stitching, and a structure extending above the ankle. It was manufactured to withstand long marches and rough terrain. But this design had not been calculated for basalt. The surface of volcanic rocks, when examined closely, possesses microscopic cutting edges. With every step, the sole of the boot scrapes against these edges. On a flat surface, this friction is negligible. There are no flat surfaces in the lava beds. Every step lands on a cutting surface at a different angle, with different pressure. The boots fell apart. First the soles thinned, then the seams burst open. Then the leather dissolved, as if decomposing into fibers. Some privates tried to bind their boots with wire and cloth. Temporary solutions remained temporary. The delay in fresh boot supplies, an inevitable consequence of logistical issues, accelerated the process. By mid-April, a significant portion of the unit was moving with either completely ruined boots or feet wrapped in cloth. Some were forced to move barefoot. This sentence seems abstract. It needs to be made concrete. Walking barefoot on volcanic basalt is unlike any experience one could encounter in any known type of terrain. The surface is both sharp and irregular. The foot is wounded in different ways at different points with every step. Cuts are inevitable. The cuts filling with volcanic dust is inevitable. Under these conditions, infection takes hold within days. Medical care was on the field, but inadequate. There was no operating theater. Sterilization conditions were limited. Morphine was scarce. A portion of the wounded privates entered a process leading to toe or foot amputations due to infection. This is reflected in the logs of the field surgeons. Battlefield casualties, meaning those directly wounded by Modoc rifles, were nearly equaled by terrain-induced injuries and infections by mid-April. The enemy was no longer just behind the rocks. It was in the rock itself. Nutrition was a separate issue altogether. Supply lines had become irregular. Fresh provisions would not arrive on some days. The unit made do with stockpiled supplies. The quality and variety of these supplies plummeted over the weeks. An undernourished body surrenders much faster to cold and fatigue. The overall physical resilience of the unit by the end of April had fallen significantly below what it was in early January. But the real devastation came at night. The Modoc warriors had taken their night tactics beyond positional warfare. By day they fired, changed positions, and remained invisible among the rocks. By night they deployed a different strategy: sound. At first it seemed like a natural occurrence, a sound from among the rocks, distant, vague, then closer, then familiar. A name. The Modoc warriors had learned the names of the American soldiers. Exactly how this information was acquired is not fully documented. Perhaps from commands heard during skirmishes, perhaps from fleeing or surrendering privates. Perhaps the acoustics of the lava beds carried sounds traveling through the rocks differently than they thought. How they learned it was not as important as the consequences. At certain hours of the night, a voice would rise from the rocks. It called out the name of a private, mostly in English. Sometimes the accent was broken, but the words were understandable. James, or a surname, or a nickname, something only that private's immediate circle would know. The private, hearing the voice, asks an inevitable question: how do they know? The answer to this question cognitively breeds catastrophe. Knowing your name means they are observing you. If they have observed you, they have seen you. If they have seen you, they could have killed you earlier. And if they did not kill you earlier, why aren't they killing you now? The most reasonable answer to this question, that you are alive by their choice, is a mentally excruciating truth to bear. There are records documenting the effect these voices created in the Army. A captain wrote this in his officer's log. It is reported that the privates wake up hearing sharp voices from their sleep and cannot fall back asleep until morning. Another record documents a private firing his weapon when his name was called out in the middle of the night, the bullet striking a rock, ricocheting, and grazing the shoulder of another private in bed. In the dark, sound operates like a physical burden. It is the only sense you use to name an invisible threat. By day, you were at least tracking muzzle flashes. There was a direction. In the night, voices distorted by the acoustics of the rocks eliminate direction. The threat begins to feel as though it is coming from everywhere. This is a condition defined in clinical literature as omnidirectional threat perception. When this perception continues uninterrupted, sleep is disrupted. When sleep is disrupted, the decision-making mechanism collapses. When the decision-making mechanism collapses, reflex behaviors take over. And reflex behaviors are the exact opposite of what an organized military unit needs. It is on record that privates on guard duty fired into empty space in the middle of the night. When asked for the reason, they said they saw movement or heard a sound. In most cases, as one might guess, there was no movement or sound whatsoever. An exhausted and overstimulated nervous system produces things that are not there. These hallucinations, visual or auditory, are not organic. They are entirely understandable neurological responses produced by a healthy brain under extreme stress, but the consequences were not understandable. Nighttime gunfire generated a separate wave of panic within the unit. When one private opened fire, the other sleeping or resting. Privates reached for their weapons. A chain reaction would begin. The commander's order to cease fire sometimes required minutes of effort to halt this reaction. During those minutes, no one knew what they were firing at. No one knew if the threat was real. No one knew if their neighbor was safe. Amidst this chaos, the Modocs were silent. The psychological pressure was maintained during the daytime as well. From time to time, a Modoc warrior would shout in English from a rock formation close enough to the American position. The content varied, sometimes a challenge, sometimes an insult, sometimes just the sound of laughter. The source of these sounds was in a different direction every time, or felt as though it was coming from a different direction. Command lacked a manual to define these tactics. The military doctrine of the era did not treat psychological warfare as a systematic category. War was won with rifles, artillery, and bayonets. Classifying a voice, waiting, or remaining invisible as a weapon was outside the conceptual framework of that era. Therefore, command could not name the psychological devastation being experienced. Because they could not name it, they could not fully reflect it in the reports. Because they could not reflect it in the reports, Washington could not see this dimension. Because Washington could not see it, they could not produce a solution. The loop closed. The unit was in the same terrain in the last week of April. The same rocks, the same fog, the same invisible enemy. But it was not the same unit from 3 months prior. They had no boots. They had not slept enough. They were trying to get used to hearing a private's name rising from the darkness every night. It was impossible to get used to. The human brain responds to a recurring threat in two ways. It either becomes desensitized or hypersensitized. The conditions of the lava beds did not allow for desensitization. The threat was real. Death was real. The invisible enemy was real. Therefore, the brains remained hypersensitized, and remaining hypersensitized means living in a constant state of alarm. This alarm would not shut off. At the beginning of May, surrender negotiations resumed, this time not out of American initiative, but due to internal division on the Modoc side. The surrendering side is the one that loses the war. This is the simplest premise in military history, but the end of the Modoc War complicated this premise, because the surrendering side was also the side that had paralyzed an army of 1,000 men for 3 months. Both of these facts were true at the same time, and the American state could not allow both facts to exist simultaneously. The internal division on the Modoc front became visible in the first week of May 1873. Hooker Jim and his group had made their stance against Captain Jack clear. Following the assassination at the peace talks, American pressure had intensified, and supplies had been completely cut off. Ammunition had dropped below critical levels. Coordination among the warrior factions was breaking down. The lava beds had served as a protective fortress for 3 months, but the fortress was now turning into a cage. Hooker Jim and a group of his followers surrendered to the American forces. This surrender did not merely save their own lives. It brought something else with it, the coordinates of where Captain Jack was hiding. This betrayal, there is no need to sanitize the word. The documents used this word, determined Captain Jack's final move. The rocky area where he was hiding was surrounded. On June 1st, 1873, in the shortest and cleanest moment of the 3-month operation, Captain Jack was captured. He had a handful of warriors with him. They surrendered. The scene was almost theatrical. An army that could not hunt for months, that suffered casualties from an enemy it could not see, that lost its general, that lost its boots, that heard its own names out of the darkness at night, had finally taken captive a 50-man group that was surrendering whatever they had left. This was the victory. But this victory could not be presented the way it looked. The way Washington managed the process was shaped by the logic of institutional crisis management, not a military operation. Canby's assassination had created profound outrage in public opinion. This outrage had to be managed. The military deadlock that lasted for months bred uncomfortable questions about the command structure. These questions had to be suppressed. And most importantly, the image created by a small Modoc group resisting a modern army for so long had to be erased from historical memory as quickly as possible. The military tribunal convened in July 1873. The process was fast. Captain Jack, Shanchin John, Black Jim, and Boston Charlie. 4 people were tried. The charge was the murder of Canby and Reverend Thomas. The defense was restricted. Witness testimonies were selective. The structure of the court, while fulfilling the formal requirements of a trial process, reflected the workings of a mechanism that had predetermined the outcome. All 4 were sentenced to death by hanging. Captain Jack said something in his final statement. A portion of what he said made it into the records. A portion was lost in the translation process. The part that made it through was this: if a white man had done the same thing, he would have been remembered as a hero. This sentence was jotted down as a note in the margins of the transcript. It did not appear again in the subsequent pages. October 3rd, 1873. At Fort Klamath, the 4 men were hanged. Captain Jack, Shanchin John, Black Jim, Boston Charlie. The execution was open to the public. There was a crowd. There were photographers. The American state's desire to document this moment did not stem from a documentary urge, but served another function: to close the narrative. The image said this: here is the outcome. Here is justice. Here is a closed chapter. But the chapter did not close. It was thought to be closed. Following the execution, an unexpected process began. Unexpected because it was conducted in secret and came to light years later. Only a short time had passed after the burial of the 4 hanged bodies. The graves were reopened. The bodies were exhumed. Their skulls were severed. These skulls were carefully packaged and sent to the East Coast. The recipient was the Smithsonian Institution. At the time, the institution's physical anthropology collection was expanding rapidly. Human remains collected through various military operations and expeditions of the American government constituted a portion of this collection. The inclusion of Captain Jack's skull into this collection occurred through an administrative process. It entered the records as an anatomical specimen. This was a different form of brutality. Not a bullet fired from a rifle barrel, a signed form, an institutional shelf number, a label. The American state's effort to erase the Modoc War from historical memory was not merely crude censorship. A more systematic and effective mechanism was at work, reframing the narrative. The war was renamed the Captain Jack Rebellion. This renaming seems trivial. It is not. The word war implies two sides. The word rebellion implies only one side, a group committing an illegal act and an authority suppressing that act. The former describes a conflict. The latter describes a corrective operation. Military reports also aligned with this reframing. The duration of the deadlock was downplayed. Assessments regarding command errors were kept in internal correspondence. They did not reflect in publicly available documents. The narrative detailing the Army's ultimate victory was pushed to the forefront. The 3-month paralysis was dissolved amidst the details. It was summarized as a successful operation, conducted under harsh terrain conditions. This summarization became the raw material for the history books that would be written later. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American military historiography gave limited space to the Modoc War, and where it did, the narrative remained within the framework produced by Washington. First-hand testimonies regarding the psychological collapse of the Army, privates' diaries, officers' correspondence, field reports, waited in the archives. They were not systematically accessed. Academic interest had shifted to other wars, other narratives of victory. The lava beds, meanwhile, were silent. The volcanic basalt continued to exist independently of human memory. It remembered neither victory nor defeat. It simply was. Black, sharp, labyrinthine. That solidified fury that erupted from beneath the earth thousands of years ago had rendered all the technological superiority of an army meaningless. It had transformed the geographical knowledge of 50 people into a military weapon. This transformation did not fully make its way into the history books. If it had, the questions that needed to be asked would have followed. Which questions? The question of why numerical superiority did not work against terrain knowledge. The question of why modern weapons remain dysfunctional against an invisible enemy. The question of why a general could be killed under a peace protocol. And the most disturbing one, the question of what kind of institutional logic the state operated under when severing skulls from dead bodies to cover up this failure. These questions waited in the archives, alongside the documents, waiting for answers. The Smithsonian kept Captain Jack's skull in its collection until 1984. That year, as a result of long-standing demands by the Modoc community, the remains were repatriated. The NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which went into effect in 1990, made such repatriations a legal requirement. The law covered hundreds of institutions and thousands of remains. Captain Jack's case was resolved before this law, but the existence of the law brought the scale of the issue to light. The anatomical specimens on the Smithsonian's shelves began to be reclassified. The names beneath the labels turned back into people. The lava beds are protected today as a national monument. Visitors can enter the rocky labyrinth on guided tours. Signs explain the volcanic formations and historical events. Some signs mention 1873. What they say is true, but they do not contain the entirety of the narrative. The entirety of the narrative is this: a group historically at a radical disadvantage in terms of military technology paralyzed a numerically and technologically far superior force for 3 months by systematically deploying geographical knowledge and psychological pressure. This success was not documented by the victorious side because documenting it meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat carried an institutional cost. Instead, 4 men were hanged. Their skulls were severed. The narrative was rewritten. The volcanic basalt still stands there, black, sharp, silent,